The blood-soaked handkerchief fluttered in the merciless desert wind as Catherine Wilson crawled through the scorching sand, her husband's betrayal burning deeper than the Nevada sun against her wounded shoulder. The year was 1875, and Catherine had just learned the cruelest lesson about love and loyalty in the unforgiving wilderness west of Kingston. 3 days earlier, she'd been Catherine Lawson, wife of Emmett Lawson, a man whose charm had swept her off her feet in Sacramento 2 years prior. They'd been heading to a new life in Silver Ridge, Nevada, where Emmett claimed to have purchased a stake in a promising silver mine. The journey had been arduous but filled with hope until yesterday when everything changed. "Water," Catherine whispered, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her tongue felt like leather in her mouth as she dragged herself across the burning sand, leaving a faint trail of blood from the gunshot wound in her shoulder. Emmett had shot her. The memory crashed over her like a fever dream. The gold her father had given them for their new start had been too tempting. His eyes had changed when he saw her discover the truth that there was no mine stake, that he'd gambled away half their money in Reno. When she'd confronted him with the forged deed papers she'd found in his saddlebag, his handsome face had twisted into something unrecognizable. "You've always been too clever for your own good, Kathy," he'd said, pulling his revolver from his holster as their horses rested in the shade of a rare desert outcropping. She turned to run, but the bullet had caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around and throwing her to the ground. Through a haze of pain, she'd watched him take both horses, all their supplies, and ride off with what remained of her father's gold, leaving her to die under the merciless sun. Now, on her third day alone, Catherine knew she was dying. Her wedding ring glinted mockingly on her finger as she pulled herself forward one more time. Her vision blurred, the horizon swimming as dark spots danced before her eyes. She thought she heard the sound of hoofbeats, but she'd been hearing phantom sounds for hours now, a cruel trick of her dehydrated mind. Then a shadow fell across her face, blocking the brutal sun. With her last ounce of strength, Catherine looked up to see a man dismounting from a dun-colored horse. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see his concerned expression as he knelt beside her. "Madam, dear God, what happened to you?" His voice was deep, gentle, nothing like Emmett's smooth, practiced charm. "Water," she croaked again, unable to manage anything else. Without hesitation, the man uncorked his canteen and gently lifted her head, bringing the precious liquid to her parched lips. "Slowly now," he cautioned as she tried to gulp it down. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Catherine drank carefully, each swallow painful but life-giving. When she'd taken enough to moisten her throat, she looked up at her savior properly for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and kind eyes the color of a summer storm. Not handsome in the conventional way Emmett had been, but there was something solid and reassuring about his weathered face. "Thank you," she managed. "You've saved my life." "Name's Quincy Harding, madam," he said, reaching for a bandana to wipe her brow. "I'm heading back to my ranch outside Kingston." "What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" Catherine tried to answer, but darkness rose up to claim her, and she slipped into unconsciousness, her last sensation the strong arms of the stranger gathering her carefully against his chest. When Catherine next opened her eyes, she was lying on a soft mattress in a simply furnished but clean room. The pain in her shoulder had dulled to a throb, and clean bandages wrapped the wound. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind until memories of her desperate situation came flooding back. She tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp of pain. "Easy there," came the same deep voice she remembered from the desert. The man, Quincy, stood from a chair near the bed. "You've been out for nearly 2 days. That shoulder wound was infected something fierce." 2 days. Catherine whispered, her voice still rough. Quincy nodded, pouring water from a pitcher on the bedside table and helping her drink. "Doc Jenkins came out from Kingston yesterday. Said you were mighty lucky the bullet went clean through, but the heat and lack of water nearly killed you." Catherine sank back against the pillows, overwhelmed by all that had happened. "Where am I?" "My ranch, the Double H, about 15 miles outside Kingston." He sat back down, studying her with concern. Madam, I don't mean to pry, but I need to ask who shot you and left you out there. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes, the betrayal still fresh and raw. My husband, she whispered, turning her face away in shame. Quincy was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the anger beneath it. Your husband did this to you. Catherine nodded, unable to meet his eyes. We were traveling to Silver Ridge. He took everything, our horses, supplies, money. He left me to die. What's his name? Quincy asked quietly. Emmett Lawson, she replied, finally looking at him. But please, don't worry about that now, Quincy interrupted gently. You need to rest and heal. Mrs. Abernathy, my housekeeper, will be up shortly with some broth. You need to get your strength back. As if on cue, the door opened and an older woman with gray hair tied back in a severe bun entered carrying a tray. Her stern expression softened when she saw Catherine awake. There you are, dearie, she said, setting the tray down. Had us worried, you did. Mr. Harding here hasn't hardly slept since he brought you in. Catherine looked at Quincy in surprise, noting the dark circles under his eyes that confirmed Mrs. Abernathy's words. He stood awkwardly, as if embarrassed. I'll leave you to it, he said, heading for the door. Mrs. Wilson needs to eat and rest. How did you know my maiden name? Catherine called after him, startled. Quincy paused. You were talking in your fever, called yourself Catherine Wilson a few times before you married that. He stopped himself, seemingly unwilling to speak ill of her husband despite what he'd done. We can talk more when you're stronger. After he left, Mrs. Abernathy helped Catherine sit up enough to eat some of the rich beef broth. The older woman was brisk but kind, adjusting Catherine's pillows and checking her bandages with practiced hands. Mr. Harding's a good man, Mrs. Abernathy said as she worked. Been running this ranch alone since his pa died 3 years back. Works too hard if you ask me, but he's built this place up proper. He gave me all his water, Catherine murmured, remembering how he'd tended to her in the desert without a thought for himself. He didn't even know me, Mrs. Abernathy smiled. That's Quincy Harding for you, now you rest. Doctor said that's what you need most. Over the next few days, Catherine regained her strength slowly. The infection in her wound receded, and with each passing day, she was able to stay awake longer. Quincy visited her room daily, often bringing books or newspapers to help pass the time, though he never stayed long and seemed almost shy in her presence. One afternoon, about a week after her rescue, Catherine was sitting up in bed when Quincy knocked at her door. He entered carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. Found these in town, he said, placing the package on the bed beside her. Thought you might want something of your own to wear once you're up and about. Mrs. Abernathy helped with the sizing. Catherine unwrapped the package to find a simple but well-made blue dress, along with undergarments and other necessities. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. Thank you, she said, running her fingers over the fabric. You've been so kind, Mr. Harding. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Quincy shifted uncomfortably. No need for that. Anyone would have done the same. No, Catherine said firmly. Not anyone would have. Many would have ridden past, or she broke off, thinking of Emmett and what he had proven capable of. Quincy's expression darkened. I've been asking around about your husband, he said after a moment. Quietly, like, man matching his description was in Kingston 3 days ago, throwing money around at the Silver Dollar Saloon, said he'd struck it rich in a mining deal. Catherine's heart clenched at the confirmation that Emmett was alive and well, spending her father's money while she'd nearly died. He's a liar, she whispered. There was no mining deal. It was all a scheme to get my father's money. Quincy nodded grimly. Sheriff Daniels is keeping an eye out, but Lawson left town heading east, said something about catching a train in Elko. He's gone then, Catherine said, uncertain whether to feel relieved or bereft. Despite everything, a part of her still struggled to reconcile the man she'd married with the monster who'd shot her and left her to die. For now, Quincy agreed, his jaw tight, but men like that, they often circle back when they've spent what they stole. They sat in silence for a moment before Quincy spoke again, his voice gentler. Doc Jenkins is coming tomorrow. If he gives you the all clear, Mrs. Abernathy thought you might like to come downstairs for supper. Must be tired of these four walls by now." Catherine smiled, grateful for the change of subject. "I'd like that very much." The next day, Doc Jenkins pronounced Catherine's wound healing well and gave her permission to move about the house, though he cautioned against any strenuous activity. With Mrs. Abernathy's help, Catherine dressed in her new blue dress and made her way downstairs for the first time. The Harding ranch house was modest but solid, built of timber and local stone with wide windows that caught the evening light. The main room combined a living area and dining space, with a large fireplace along one wall and bookshelves surprisingly well stocked for a bachelor rancher. Quincy stood awkwardly when she entered, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her in the blue dress. Catherine realized with a start that this was the first time he'd seen her properly dressed and on her feet. "You look much better, Mrs. Wilson," he said, using her maiden name as she'd requested during one of his visits. "Thank you, Mr. Harding." "I feel better," she replied, taking the seat he pulled out for her at the table. Mrs. Abernathy served a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh baked bread, and apple pie for dessert. The food was simple but delicious, and Catherine found her appetite returning as they ate. Conversation was awkward at first, but gradually eased as Quincy told her about the ranch and the approaching roundup season. "We'll be busy soon," he explained. "Got about 500 head of cattle to bring in from the north pastures before winter sets in." "It sounds like quite an operation," Catherine said, impressed. "Do you manage it all yourself?" Quincy shook his head. "Got 4 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. Good men, they're out checking the far fences today." As the meal progressed, Catherine found herself studying Quincy when he wasn't looking. He was nothing like Emmett, whose polished manners and silver tongue had swept her off her feet. Quincy was quieter, more deliberate in his speech and movements. There was a steadiness to him that she found increasingly comforting. After dinner, they moved to sit by the fireplace. The October evenings were growing cool, and the crackling flames cast a warm glow over the room. Catherine sank gratefully into an armchair, still tired from her first venture downstairs. "Tell me about yourself, Mrs. Wilson," Quincy said, settling into a chair across from her. "Where were you before you met Lawson?" Catherine hesitated, then decided there was no reason to hide her past. "I grew up in Sacramento. My father owns a mercantile there. I was working as a school teacher when I met Emmett at a church social." She paused, the memories bittersweet. "He was so charming, so attentive. We were married within 3 months." "And your family?" Quincy asked gently. "My mother died when I was 16. My father, he never quite approved of Emmett, but he wanted me to be happy." Catherine twisted her hands in her lap. "He gave us $2,000 to start our new life. That's what Emmett was after, I realize now." Quincy whistled softly. "That's a substantial sum." "Yes, my father worked his whole life for it." Catherine blinked back tears. "I was such a fool." "No," Quincy said firmly, "you weren't a fool. You were betrayed by someone who should have protected you. There's a difference." His words were simple but hit her heart with unexpected force. For the first time since waking in the desert with Emmett's bullet in her shoulder, Catherine felt the knot of shame inside her loosen slightly. "What about you, Mr. Harding?" she asked, wiping away a stray tear. "Have you always lived in Kingston?" Quincy nodded, settling back in his chair. "Born and raised. My father started this ranch with just 50 acres and 20 head of cattle. By the time he died, we had over 2,000 acres. Pride colored his voice. I've added another 1,000 since." "That's impressive," Catherine said sincerely. "You must work very hard." "It's a good life," he replied with a small shrug. "Lonely at times, but honest work." The way he said honest made Catherine wonder if he was comparing himself to Emmett, but his expression revealed nothing. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more easily as they grew comfortable with each other. When Catherine began to tire, Quincy immediately noticed and helped her back upstairs to her room. At the door, Catherine turned to him. "Thank you, Mr. Harding." "Not just for dinner, but for everything." Quincy's weather-beaten face softened. "You can call me Quincy if you'd like. Mr. Harding was my father." Catherine smiled. "Then you must call me Catherine." His answering smile transformed his face, making him suddenly, unexpectedly handsome. "Good night, Catherine. Sleep well." As October gave way to November, Catherine grew stronger each day. Her shoulder healed, leaving a puckered scar that she knew would always remind her of Emmett's betrayal. She began to help Mrs. Abernathy with household tasks, grateful to be useful after weeks of convalescence. The question of her future hung over her, unaddressed but ever present. She had no money, no husband, though she wasn't sure if Emmett's actions constituted legal abandonment, and nowhere to go. Her father's home in Sacramento seemed impossibly distant without funds for the journey. One morning, as Catherine helped Mrs. Abernathy knead dough for the day's bread, the housekeeper broached the subject directly. "What will you do now, dearie? Will you try to go back to your father?" Catherine's hands stilled in the flour. "I've been thinking about that. I should write to him, at least let him know what happened," she sighed. "But I'm ashamed to face him after being so foolish about Emmett." Mrs. Abernathy's usually stern face softened. "Families forgive, child." "That's what they're for." "Perhaps," Catherine agreed. "But even if I wanted to go home, I have no money for the journey." She resumed kneading with more vigor than necessary. "I need to find work here in Kingston, I suppose. I was a school teacher before I married." "Maybe there's a position available." Mrs. Abernathy exchanged a look with Quincy, who had just entered the kitchen. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Actually, I spoke with Mrs. Thornton yesterday. She runs the school in town," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Their teacher left last month to get married. They've been looking for a replacement." Catherine stared at him, flour coating her hands. You asked about a teaching position for me," Quincy shrugged, looking uncomfortable under her gaze. "Seemed logical, given your experience, Mrs. Thornton said they'd be happy to speak with you if you're interested." "That's very thoughtful of you," Catherine said, touched by his consideration, "but I wouldn't want to impose on your hospitality until I could afford lodgings in town." "You're not imposing," Quincy said quickly. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. The ranch is closer to the school than town anyway." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Besides, with winter coming on, the journey to Sacramento would be difficult, perhaps in the spring. The unspoken suggestion hung in the air that she might stay through the winter, at least. Catherine felt a curious mixture of relief and something else she couldn't quite name at the prospect of remaining at Double H Ranch. "If you're certain I wouldn't be in the way, that seems the most sensible plan," she agreed finally. "And I would very much like to speak with Mrs. Thornton about the teaching position." Quincy's face brightened. "I'll take you into town tomorrow then. Need to pick up supplies anyway." The next day, Catherine experienced her first trip to Kingston. The small settlement nestled in a valley surrounded by sagebrush-covered hills. Its main street lined with wooden buildings including a general store, a bank, the Silver Dollar Saloon, and a small white-painted church. Despite its modest size, the town hummed with activity as miners, ranchers, and merchants went about their business. Catherine felt strangely nervous as she walked beside Quincy toward the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building at the edge of town. She was acutely aware of curious glances from townspeople, and she wondered what rumors might have spread about the wounded woman Quincy Harding had rescued from the desert. Mrs. Thornton, the head of the school board, was a plump, energetic woman with shrewd eyes that seemed to assess Catherine's worth in a single glance. However, she warmed considerably when Catherine described her 3 years of teaching experience in Sacramento. "We have 28 pupils, ages 6 to 15, Mrs. Thornton explained as she showed Catherine around the schoolroom. "Can you handle such a range?" "I had 35 pupils of similar ages in Sacramento," Catherine assured her. "I believe in tailoring lessons to each child's abilities, using the older children to help guide the younger ones when appropriate." Mrs. Thornton nodded approvingly. "When could you start?" "Immediately, if needed," Catherine replied, surprised by the quick offer. "Monday, then." 8 o'clock sharp, Mrs. Thornton extended her hand. "The position pays $40 a month. We can't compete with city salaries, I'm afraid." "That's more than generous," Catherine said sincerely, shaking the woman's hand. $40 would allow her to save for her eventual return to Sacramento while contributing something to the Hardings for her room and board. As they left the schoolhouse, Quincy looked down at her with a small smile. "Successful, I take it?" "Yes." "I start on Monday," Catherine replied, unable to contain her excitement. For the first time since Emmett's betrayal, she felt a glimmer of hope for her future. They spent the rest of the morning at the general store, where Quincy purchased ranch supplies while Catherine selected a few necessities: hairpins, writing paper, and a second dress for teaching. When she tried to pay with the small amount of money Quincy had insisted on giving her as an advance for helping around the ranch, he quietly waved her off. "Consider it a gift to celebrate your new position," he said, and would hear no argument. As they loaded the wagon for the return journey to the ranch, Catherine noticed a group of men outside the Silver Dollar watching them. One nudged another and gestured in their direction, his expression unpleasant. Quincy noticed them too, his jaw tightening as he helped Catherine onto the wagon seat. "Who are those men?" she asked as they pulled away from the hitching post. "Trouble," Quincy replied grimly. "Work for the Circle T Ranch north of here. Their boss, Tom Blackwell, has been trying to buy me out for years, wants my water rights." "Is that why they were looking at us that way?" Quincy hesitated. "Partly, but mostly it's because there's been talk about you staying at my ranch." Catherine felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, I didn't think." "Small towns and their gossip," Quincy said with forced lightness. "Don't you worry about it. Those who matter know the truth of things." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the journey into town had been, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Catherine hadn't considered how her presence at the ranch might appear to others, and she felt a stab of guilt at the thought of damaging Quincy's reputation after all he'd done for her. That evening after supper, while Mrs. Abernathy was in the kitchen, Catherine broached the subject directly. "Perhaps I should look for lodgings in town," she said quietly. "I wouldn't want to cause you any difficulty with your neighbors." Quincy, who had been reading a newspaper by the fire, looked up sharply. "Is that what you want?" "No," Catherine admitted honestly. "But after what you mentioned about the talk in town, let them talk," Quincy interrupted, setting aside his paper. "Mrs. Abernathy lives here. You're recovering from a serious injury. There's nothing improper about the arrangement." Catherine studied him for a moment. In the firelight, his strong features were softened, making him look younger than his 32 years. "You've been very kind to me, Quincy. I don't want to repay that kindness by bringing you trouble." Quincy's expression grew serious. "Catherine, the only trouble I'd have is if you left before you were ready, on account of some small-minded gossip." He leaned forward, his gray eyes intent on hers. "Do you feel safe here?" The question surprised her. "Yes, of course. And you're comfortable, Mrs. Abernathy isn't working you too hard." Catherine smiled at that. "No, if anything, she scolds me for doing too much." "Then stay," Quincy said simply. "At least through the winter. Come spring, if you still want to return to Sacramento, I'll see you safely there myself." The sincerity in his voice touched Catherine deeply. She realized that in the weeks since he'd found her half dead in the desert, Quincy Harding had become more than just her rescuer, he'd become her friend. Perhaps her only friend in this part of the world. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'd like to stay then." Something flickered in Quincy's eyes, relief perhaps, or something more, but he merely nodded and returned to his newspaper. Catherine picked up her mending, and they passed the rest of the evening in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them. Monday morning arrived with a light dusting of early snow, the first of the season. Catherine dressed carefully in her blue dress, pinned her hair neatly, and ate a hearty breakfast prepared by Mrs. Abernathy, who seemed almost as nervous as Catherine about the first day of school. "You'll do wonderfully, dearie," the housekeeper assured her, packing a lunch pail. "Those children are lucky to have a proper Sacramento-educated teacher." Quincy insisted on driving Catherine to the schoolhouse himself, though it meant delaying the start of his own workday. As they traveled through the crisp morning air, Catherine found herself grateful for his steady presence beside her, calming her nerves. "I'll come by at 4 to bring you home," he said as he helped her down from the wagon in front of the schoolhouse where children were already gathering. "You don't need to do that," Catherine protested. "I'm sure one of the parents, 4 o'clock, Quincy repeated with a gentle smile. "Good luck, Schoolmarm Wilson." The title made her laugh, breaking the tension, and she nodded gratefully before turning to greet her new pupils. 28 curious faces looked back at her as she opened the schoolhouse door, and Catherine felt a surge of confidence. This, at least, was something she knew how to do. The day passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing classroom routines. The children ranged from shy to boisterous, but all seemed eager to impress their new teacher. By the time the final bell rang at 3:30, Catherine was exhausted but exhilarated. Teaching again felt right, like reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost during her brief, disastrous marriage. True to his word, Quincy arrived at 4 o'clock, his wagon a welcome sight as Catherine gathered her things. Several parents had stayed to meet her, and she noticed their curious glances between her and the rancher. Quincy, for his part, was unfailingly polite, but gave no indication that he and Catherine were anything other than neighbors, for which she was grateful. As the days turned to weeks, Catherine settled into a comfortable routine. Weekdays were spent at the schoolhouse, weekends helping at the ranch. She insisted on contributing to her keep, despite Quincy's protests, by helping Mrs. Abernathy with cooking and cleaning, and even learning to make soap and candles for the coming winter months. November brought more snow and the completion of the fall roundup. Quincy and his men worked long hours bringing in the last of the cattle from distant pastures, often returning to the ranch after dark, exhausted and hungry. Catherine made sure hot meals were waiting, no matter the hour, earning grateful looks from the weary cowboys. On a particularly cold evening in late November, Quincy returned alone long after the other men had gone to their bunks. Catherine, who had been reading by the fire, looked up in concern when he stumbled through the door, his face pale beneath its tan. "Quincy, what happened?" She exclaimed, hurrying to help him remove his snow-covered coat. "Nothing to fuss about," he muttered, though he winced as he straightened. "Horse spooked at a rattler, took a tumble down a ravine." "Sit down this instant," Catherine ordered, guiding him to a chair by the fire. "Where does it hurt?" "Ribs, mostly," Quincy admitted, sinking gratefully into the chair. "And my pride." Catherine shook her head at his attempt at humor. "I'll make a poultice, and you should wrap those ribs." She hesitated, then added, "I can help if you'll allow it." Quincy's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "Thank you." Catherine gathered the necessary supplies, which hazel, clean bandages, and a poultice of mustard and flour that Mrs. Abernathy had taught her to make. When she returned to the fireside, Quincy had removed his shirt, exposing a torso already darkening with bruises along his left side. Catherine tried to maintain a professional demeanor as she knelt beside his chair to apply the poultice, but she couldn't help noticing the solid strength of his broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist, muscles hardened by years of physical labor. This close, she could smell the clean scent of his skin beneath the tang of sweat and horses. "This may sting," she warned, applying the poultice gently. Quincy inhaled sharply but made no sound of complaint as she worked. Catherine was intensely aware of his eyes on her face, of the intimate nature of what she was doing, but she kept her focus on the task. "Why were you out alone so late?" she asked to break the tension as she began wrapping the bandages around his ribs, checking the north fence line. "There have been reports of cattle rustlers in the area." He winced as she pulled the bandage snug. "Didn't want to risk sending one of the boys alone." "So you risked yourself instead," Catherine said, unable to keep a hint of scolding from her voice. Quincy's mouth curved in a small smile. "It's my ranch, and these men depend on you," Catherine countered, securing the bandage. "What would happen to them if you broke your neck in that ravine?" The smile faded from Quincy's face. "You sound like my father. He always said a good rancher knows when to lead and when to delegate." He sighed. "Still working on that part, I guess." Catherine sat back on her heels, studying him. In that moment, with his defenses lowered by pain and exhaustion, she could see the weight of responsibility he carried not just for the land and cattle, but for the men who worked for him, for Mrs. Abernathy, and now in some way for her. "You're a good man, Quincy Harding," she said softly. "But even good men need rest." Something flickered in his gray eyes, surprise perhaps, or something deeper that made her heart beat a little faster. Then he looked away, reaching for his shirt. "Thank you for the doctoring," he said, his voice gruff. "I should get some sleep." Catherine helped him to his feet, concerned by the stiffness in his movements. "Will you be able to manage the stairs?" "I'll be fine," he assured her, though the tightness around his eyes belied his words. At the foot of the staircase, he turned back to her. "Catherine," yes, for a moment it seemed he might say something important, but then he shook his head slightly. "Good night." "Good night, Quincy," she replied, watching him make his slow way up the stairs before returning to bank the fire for the night. As she prepared for bed, Catherine found her thoughts returning to that moment by the fire, the vulnerable strength of him under her hands, the unspoken something that had passed between them. With a start, she realized that what she'd felt was attraction, pure and simple. Attraction to a man who was nothing like the husband who had betrayed her, a man whose quiet integrity revealed itself in actions rather than words. The realization both frightened and exhilarated her. After Emmett's betrayal, she'd believed herself incapable of ever trusting a man again, let alone feeling anything more complicated. Yet here she was, her heart quickening at the memory of Quincy's eyes on her face as she tended his wounds. Winter descended on Kingston in earnest as December arrived, bringing heavy snowfall that often made the journey between the ranch and town treacherous. On the worst days, Quincy insisted that Catherine stay home rather than risk the trip to school, though she protested that her pupils would fall behind. "Books can wait," he told her firmly after a particularly vicious storm. "Your safety can't." Christmas approached, bringing a festive atmosphere to both the schoolhouse and the ranch. Catherine helped her pupils prepare a small pageant for their parents, while at home, she and Mrs. Abernathy baked cookies and strung popcorn garlands for the small pine tree Quincy, and the ranch hands had cut and brought into the house. On Christmas Eve, after a hearty dinner with the ranch hands and their families, Quincy presented Catherine with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. "It's not much," he said almost shyly as she untied the ribbon, "but I thought you might like it." Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with an intricate pattern of wildflowers. Catherine ran her fingers over the supple leather, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Quincy, it's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." "Thought you might want to write down your experiences," he explained. "Teaching stories or whatever comes to mind." Catherine had been saving for weeks to purchase gifts from the general store. For Mrs. Abernathy, she'd bought a fine wool shawl in a rich burgundy color. For Quincy, after much deliberation, she'd selected a silver pocket watch to replace the battered tin one he carried. When she handed him the small box, his surprise was evident. "You didn't need to get me anything," he protested. "I wanted to," Catherine replied simply. "Open it." Quincy's expression as he lifted the watch from its box made Catherine's heart swell. He turned it over in his hands, admiring the craftsmanship, before looking up at her with such warmth in his eyes that she felt her cheeks flush. "This is too fine a gift," he said quietly. "Not for all you've done," Catherine insisted. "Please, I want you to have it." Their eyes held for a long moment before Mrs. Abernathy bustled in with a tray of hot cider, breaking the spell. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly with carols around the piano that had belonged to Quincy's mother, and stories of Christmases past. Late that night, after the guests had gone and Mrs. Abernathy had retired to her room, Catherine found herself alone with Quincy by the dying fire. Snow fell softly outside the windows, creating a cocoon of quiet around the ranch house. "It's been a good Christmas," Quincy said, his voice low in the stillness. "Best one I've had in years." Catherine smiled, watching the firelight play across his strong features. "For me as well." "Even though you're far from home, from your father?" Quincy asked, studying her face. "I've written to him," Catherine replied. "Explained everything that happened with Emmett. He wants me to come home in the spring, of course, but—" She hesitated, unsure how to express what she was feeling. "But," Quincy prompted gently. Catherine took a deep breath. "But I'm not certain that's what I want anymore." The admission hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Quincy's expression was unreadable in the flickering light. "What do you want, Catherine?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could answer, a violent pounding at the front door shattered the moment. Quincy was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the revolver he kept in a drawer by the fireplace. "Stay back," he warned Catherine as he moved cautiously to the door. The pounding came again, accompanied by a man's voice calling Quincy's name. Catherine recognized it as belonging to Jim Parker, one of the ranch hands who lived in town with his family. Quincy opened the door to reveal Parker, snow-covered and agitated. "What is it, Jim?" "It's your cattle, boss," Parker gasped. "Rustlers hit the north pasture. Sam and the boys are trying to head them off, but they're outnumbered." Quincy's face hardened. "How many?" "5, maybe 6 men. They've already got about 50 head moving toward the pass." "I'll saddle up," Quincy said, already reaching for his coat and hat. "Wake the bunkhouse, get everyone mounted." "Quincy, you can't," Catherine protested, fear gripping her heart. "Your ribs haven't fully healed, and in this weather, I have to," Quincy cut her off, though his expression softened as he turned to her. "Those cattle are our livelihood." Catherine wanted to argue further, but the determined set of his jaw told her it would be futile. Instead, she hurried to help him into his coat, her fingers trembling as she buttoned it against the bitter cold. "Be careful," she whispered, searching his face. For a brief moment, Quincy cupped her cheek with his gloved hand. "Stay inside, lock the doors, Mrs. Abernathy has a shotgun if there's trouble." Then he was gone, striding out into the swirling snow with Parker. Catherine stood in the doorway watching until the darkness swallowed them, her heart pounding with fear for his safety. The night stretched endlessly as Catherine waited for news. Mrs. Abernathy joined her in the kitchen after an hour, making coffee and trying to distract them both with conversation, but the worry was etched deeply on the older woman's face as well. "He's a capable man," Mrs. Abernathy said, pouring coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "Known how to handle trouble since he was a boy." "What if it's Blackwell's men?" Catherine asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her mind. "Quincy mentioned there's bad blood between them." Mrs. Abernathy's lips tightened. "Tom Blackwell's a snake, make no mistake. Been trying to force Quincy off this land for years. But even he wouldn't be fool enough to steal cattle with his own men." The hours crawled by, midnight passing into the small hours of Christmas morning. Catherine dozed fitfully at the kitchen table, jerking awake at every sound, real or imagined. When dawn finally broke, pale and clear after the night's storm, she was at the window instantly, scanning the snow-covered landscape for any sign of the men's return. It was nearly noon when they finally appeared, a weary procession of riders coming slowly down the hill toward the ranch. Catherine counted anxiously, her breath fogging the cold window pane, and felt a rush of relief when she spotted Quincy among them, riding tall despite obvious exhaustion. She and Mrs. Abernathy hurried outside, heedless of the cold, as the men dismounted in the yard. Quincy's face was drawn with fatigue, a darkening bruise on his cheekbone, but his eyes lit up when he saw Catherine. "You're hurt," she said, reaching up instinctively to touch his bruised face. "It's nothing," Quincy assured her, catching her hand in his. "We recovered most of the cattle. Lost about a dozen head, but could have been worse." "Did you catch the rustlers?" Mrs. Abernathy asked as she directed the weary ranch hands toward the kitchen where hot food waited. Quincy's expression darkened. "2 of them. The others got away." "Who were they?" Catherine asked, still holding his cold hand in both of hers. Quincy exchanged a look with Parker before answering. "Hired guns, not from around here." He hesitated, then added, "but they were carrying Circle T money." "Blackwell," Mrs. Abernathy hissed, her usually kind face hardening. "That proves it. It suggests it," Quincy corrected wearily. "Sheriff Daniels has the men in custody. We'll see if they talk." He swayed slightly on his feet, and Catherine immediately slipped an arm around his waist to steady him. You need rest, she insisted, and hot food, come inside. Quincy didn't protest as she led him into the house, a testament to his exhaustion. After a quick meal, he allowed Catherine to check his ribs, which thankfully hadn't been further damaged in the night's adventures, though fresh bruises bloomed across his torso. What happened? She asked softly as she applied witch hazel to the worst of them. Got into a scuffle with one of the rustlers, Quincy admitted. Big fellow had me at a disadvantage until Sam got there. Catherine's hands stilled on his skin. You could have been killed, but I wasn't, Quincy said simply. He caught her wrist gently as she resumed her ministrations. I'm sorry I ruined our Christmas. Catherine looked up, surprised. You didn't ruin anything. You protected your ranch, your livelihood. Still, Quincy persisted, it's not how I wanted to spend today, not with you. The simple honesty in his voice made Catherine's breath catch. There will be other Christmases, she said softly, then realized the implication of her words that she might still be here next Christmas and the one after that. Quincy's eyes held hers for a long moment before he nodded. Yes. There will be. After that night, something shifted between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since the day Quincy found Catherine dying in the desert. They didn't speak of it directly, but it was there in the way his eyes followed her across a room, in the way she lingered near him when they sat by the fire in the evenings, in the casual touches that became more frequent and deliberate. January brought bitter cold and news from the sheriff that the captured rustlers had indeed implicated Tom Blackwell, though without direct evidence, no charges could be brought against the neighboring rancher. Quincy doubled the guard on his herds and warned his men to be vigilant, especially when riding alone. The tension with Blackwell cast a shadow over the ranch, but life continued. Catherine threw herself into her teaching, delighting in her pupils' progress and the growing respect she earned from their parents. At the ranch, she became ever more integrated into daily life, no longer a guest but an essential part of the household. One evening in late January, as they sat together after supper, Quincy broached a subject they had both been avoiding. I received a letter from a friend in Elko today, he said carefully, setting aside his newspaper. He mentioned seeing a man matching Emmett Lawson's description there last week. Catherine felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the winter weather. Did he say what Emmett was doing? Quincy's jaw tightened. Gambling, mostly. Apparently he's run through a good portion of your money. Catherine nodded slowly, surprised by her own lack of emotion at the news. Once, the thought of Emmett would have sent her into a spiral of hurt and anger. Now, he seemed like a character from a story she'd read long ago, significant in the narrative of her life, but increasingly distant. Are you all right? Quincy asked, watching her closely. Yes, Catherine said, realizing it was true. I find I don't care what becomes of him anymore. He made his choice that day in the desert. Quincy studied her for a moment longer before speaking again. There's something else, he hesitated. My friend mentioned that Lawson was asking questions about Kingston, about a schoolteacher there. This did send a jolt of fear through Catherine. He knows I'm alive, that I'm here. It seems so, Quincy confirmed grimly. I've already spoken to Sheriff Daniels. He'll keep an eye out. Catherine twisted her hands in her lap, her mind racing. Why would he come here? He left me for dead. He has what he wanted, my father's money. Men like Lawson, Quincy said carefully, they don't like loose ends. You're a witness to his crimes, and if you're alive, to testify against him. He could hang, Catherine finished, understanding dawning, or at least go to prison. Quincy nodded. I won't let him hurt you again, Catherine, I promise you that. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Catherine's heart swell. She reached across the space between them to take his hand, an unprecedented boldness that surprised them both. I know, she said softly. I trust you, Quincy. His fingers tightened around hers, warm and strong. For a long moment, they sat in silence, hands linked, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. Then, with gentle deliberation, Quincy raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender that tears sprang to Catherine's eyes. Quincy, she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. He released her hand slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I care for you, Catherine, more than I should, perhaps, more than I meant to. I care for you too, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I have for some time now. Quincy's expression softened, hope brightening his storm-gray eyes. I've been afraid to say anything. After what you've been through, I didn't want to press you. You've never pressed me, Catherine said, finding courage in his honesty. You've given me nothing but kindness and respect since the day you found me. You deserve nothing less, Quincy replied simply. Catherine thought of all the differences between this good, solid man and the charming liar she had married. Where Emmett had swept her off her feet with grand gestures and practiced compliments, Quincy had won her heart through 1,000 small kindnesses, the quiet thoughtfulness of his care, the unwavering respect he showed her, the gentle way he encouraged her independence, even as he protected her. May I? Quincy began hesitantly, then seemed to lose his nerve. May you what? Catherine prompted, her heart racing. May I court you properly? He asked finally. When you're ready, of course. I know your situation is complicated. Catherine smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. I'd like that very much. The smile that broke across Quincy's face transformed it completely, erasing the worry lines that had become so familiar. In that moment, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened with Emmett, whatever challenges lay ahead, she had found something rare and precious with Quincy Harding, something worth fighting for. February brought a brief thaw and with it, trouble. The first sign came when Catherine was walking home from school, having insisted she could make the short journey alone on such a fine afternoon. She was halfway between town and the ranch when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Turning, she saw a rider approaching at a leisurely pace, a man she didn't recognize. Afternoon, madam, he said, tipping his hat as he drew alongside her. He was middle-aged, expensively dressed, with cold eyes that belied his cordial tone. You must be the new schoolteacher I've heard about. I am, Catherine replied cautiously. Catherine Wilson. Wilson, the man repeated, as if testing the name. Not Lawson, then? Catherine's blood ran cold. She stopped walking, one hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer Quincy had insisted she carry in her pocket. Who are you, sir? Thomas Blackwell, the man replied, watching her reaction with evident satisfaction. I own the Circle T Ranch north of here. Catherine maintained her composure with effort. Mr. Blackwell, I've heard your name mentioned. I'll bet you have, Blackwell chuckled without humor. Quincy Harding and I have been at odds for some time. He leaned forward in his saddle. But that's not why I stopped. I met an interesting fellow in Elko last week, man by the name of Emmett Lawson, said he was looking for his wife. Catherine's fingers closed around the derringer. I'm afraid I can't help you, Mr. Blackwell. If you'll excuse me, I'm expected at home. Of course, Blackwell nodded, straightening in his saddle. Just thought you should know your husband seemed mighty determined to find you, said something about unfinished business. He tipped his hat again. Good day, Mrs. Wilson, or whatever your name really is. With that, he turned his horse and rode toward town, leaving Catherine standing in the road, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hurried the rest of the way to the ranch, looking over her shoulder frequently, the encounter replaying in her mind. Quincy was working in the corral when she arrived, but one look at her face told him something was wrong. He vaulted the fence and strode to meet her, concern etched in his features. What happened? He demanded, taking her trembling hands in his. Catherine told him about the encounter with Blackwell, watching his expression darken with each word. By the time she finished, his jaw was clenched so tightly she could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. He's working with Lawson, Quincy said flatly. Has to be. Blackwell must have recognized your name when he heard about the new schoolteacher, put it together with what Lawson told him. But why would they work together? Catherine asked, struggling to understand. What could Emmett offer Blackwell? Quincy's expression was grim. Blackwell wants my land. Lawson wants you silenced. They could help each other. The implications sent a chill down Catherine's spine. Quincy, I won't bring danger to your door. Perhaps I should leave, go back to Sacramento. No, Quincy interrupted, his hands tightening on hers. Running won't solve this. Lawson would only follow you there and you'd be alone. His voice softened. Besides, I don't want you to go. The simple honesty in his words steadied her. "What should we do? First, we tell Sheriff Daniels about Blackwell's threat," Quincy decided. "Then we wait. They've shown their hand by having Blackwell approach you. They wanted to frighten you." "It worked," Catherine admitted shakily. Quincy pulled her into his arms then, holding her against his chest with a gentleness that belied his strength. "I won't let them hurt you," he murmured into her hair. "Either of them." Catherine closed her eyes, drawing comfort from his solid presence, from the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. For the first time since Emmett's betrayal, she allowed herself to feel truly vulnerable, knowing that with Quincy, vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was trust. The confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days after Catherine's encounter with Blackwell, she was alone at the ranch house with Mrs. Abernathy, Quincy having ridden out at dawn to check cattle with his men. The morning had passed uneventfully, with Catherine grading papers at the kitchen table while Mrs. Abernathy prepared stew for the evening meal. The sound of approaching horses around noon brought Catherine to the window. Her blood froze at the sight of 2 riders coming up the drive, one she recognized immediately as Blackwell, the other. "Emmett," she whispered, her mouth suddenly dry. He looked much as she remembered, handsome in a polished way, though his clothes were less fine than they had been, his face harder. She had once thought his blue eyes captivating, now they just seemed cold. "Mrs. Abernathy," Catherine said urgently, "go to the bunkhouse. Find anyone who's there. Send them for Quincy and the sheriff." The housekeeper took one look out the window and nodded grimly, grabbing her shawl. "What about you, dearie?" Catherine thought quickly. "I'll keep them talking. Go out the back door." Once Mrs. Abernathy had slipped away, Catherine took a deep breath and moved to the front door, the derringer a reassuring weight in her pocket. She stepped onto the porch just as the men dismounted. "Hello, Kathy," Emmett said, his voice as smooth as she remembered. "You're looking well for a dead woman." Catherine held herself tall, refusing to show fear. "What do you want, Emmett?" He smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Is that any way to greet your husband after so long apart? I've been worried sick about you. You shot me and left me to die in the desert," Catherine replied coldly. "Forgive me if I doubt your concern," Blackwell chuckled, leaning against the porch rail. "She's got spirit, Lawson. You didn't mention that." Emmett ignored him, his eyes fixed on Catherine. "That was a misunderstanding, darling. I was angry, not thinking clearly. I came back for you later, but you were gone." The blatant lie might once have confused her, made her doubt herself. Now it only strengthened her resolve. "What do you really want, Emmett? The money's gone, isn't it? You've gambled it away." A flash of anger crossed his handsome face. "Not all of it, but that's not why I'm here." He took a step closer. "You're my wife, Kathy. I've come to take you home." "This is my home now," Catherine said firmly. "And I stopped being your wife the moment you pulled that trigger." "Legally, she's right," Blackwell interjected with false helpfulness. "Nevada territory has pretty liberal divorce laws. Attempted murder is solid grounds." Emmett shot him an irritated look before turning back to Catherine, his expression hardening. "I didn't ride all this way for a legal debate." "You're coming with me, Kathy, now, or what?" Catherine challenged, her hand moving to her pocket. "Or we burn this place to the ground," Blackwell said pleasantly, "starting with this charming house." Catherine's stomach twisted with fear, not for herself, but for everything Quincy had built, everything he loved. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Blackwell? What has Quincy Harding ever done to you except refuse to sell you his land?" "That's reason enough," Blackwell replied, his pleasant mask slipping to reveal the bitterness beneath. "Harding's water rights are choking my ranch. I've offered him fair prices for years." "So this is about land?" Catherine asked incredulously. "You'd help a would-be murderer to get water rights." "Business is business," Blackwell shrugged. "Lawson helps me get Harding's land, I help him get you. Simple transaction." "I'm not a piece of property to be traded," Catherine said, anger overriding her fear. "Actually, by law, you sort of are," Emmett smirked, taking another step toward the porch. "A wife belongs to her husband. Now come along quietly, Kathy. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Catherine pulled the derringer from her pocket, aiming it steadily at Emmett's chest. "Stay back." Emmett froze, surprise flashing across his face before he laughed. You won't shoot me, Kathy, you don't have it in you. I didn't, Catherine agreed, before you left me to die. A person changes after something like that. Her voice was calm, her hand steady. I don't want to shoot you, Emmett. But I will if you take another step. The standoff stretched for a long, tense moment, then Blackwell sighed dramatically, drawing his own pistol. This is getting tiresome. Put down the pea-shooter, Mrs. Lawson, or I'll put a bullet in you myself. Your husband wants you alive, but I don't particularly care either way. Catherine didn't lower the Derringer, though her heart raced at the sight of Blackwell's gun. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability. One small Derringer against their two pistols, helped possibly hours away if misses. Abernathy had even managed to find anyone at the bunkhouse. You won't get away with this, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Sheriff Daniels already knows about your threats. Sheriff Daniels is one man with one deputy, Blackwell sneered. And he's conveniently occupied with a disturbance at my saloon in town right now. Catherine's blood ran cold at the implication that their appearance at the ranch had been carefully planned. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew all their attention. Emmett cursed, drawing his gun as he turned toward the sound. Around the bend of the drive came not just Quincy and his ranch hands as Catherine had hoped, but Sheriff Daniels as well, leading a group of armed men. They thundered into the yard, surrounding Emmett and Blackwell before either could react. Drop your weapons, Sheriff Daniels barked, his rifle aimed at Blackwell. Both of you now, Blackwell hesitated, his eyes darting between the sheriff and the surrounding men, clearly calculating his odds. Slowly, he lowered his gun to the ground. Emmett, however, kept his pistol raised, his face contorted with rage as he turned back toward Catherine. This is your fault, he snarled, taking a step toward the porch. Everything was fine until you started asking questions about those papers. I said drop it, Lawson, the sheriff repeated. Don't make this worse for yourself. Emmett's eyes were wild, desperate. Catherine realized with sudden clarity that he was going to shoot, that in his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one would. She raised the Derringer, her finger tightening on the trigger. Before either of them could fire, another shot cracked through the air. Emmett staggered, his pistol falling from his hand as he clutched his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. Catherine turned to see Quincy lowering his smoking revolver, his expression hard as granite. It's over, Lawson, Quincy said coldly as Sheriff Daniels dismounted to secure the wounded man. You won't hurt her again. Catherine lowered the Derringer, her legs suddenly weak with relief. Quincy was at her side in an instant, supporting her with a strong arm around her waist. Are you all right? He asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. I'm fine, she assured him, leaning into his strength. How did you know to come, and with the sheriff, Mrs.? Abernathy found one of the hands at the bunkhouse, Quincy explained. He rode out to get me, but we were already on our way back. We met the sheriff on the road. Turns out Blackwell's distraction in town didn't work as planned. One of his men got drunk and started talking too much. Catherine watched as the sheriff and his men disarmed and handcuffed both Emmett and Blackwell. Emmett's face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes still burned with hatred as they fell on Catherine and Quincy together on the porch. She's still my wife, he spat as the sheriff pushed him toward a waiting horse. Not for much longer, Sheriff Daniels replied matter-of-factly. Attempted murder tends to speed up divorce proceedings in this territory, especially when there are multiple witnesses to your confession just now. He nodded respectfully to Catherine. Madam, I'll need you to come into town tomorrow to give a formal statement. I'll be there, Catherine promised, still leaning against Quincy's solid warmth. As the sheriff's party rode away with their prisoners, Catherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she'd been carrying since that terrible day in the desert. Emmett no longer had power over her, not physically and not in her heart. She looked up at Quincy, finding his gray eyes already on her face, filled with concern and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. I almost lost you, he said quietly, his arm tightening around her waist. Catherine shook her head. No, you found me, remember, in the desert. You gave me all your water. Best decision I ever made, Quincy replied with a small smile that faded quickly. when I saw Lawson's gun pointed at you. But you stopped him, Catherine said, reaching up to touch his face gently. You kept your promise, you protected me. Quincy turned his head slightly to press a kiss to her palm, his eyes never leaving hers. I always will, Catherine, if you'll let me. The question in his words was unmistakable. Catherine felt tears of joy prick her eyes as she nodded. I'd like that very much. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, Quincy leaned down and kissed her. His lips were warm and sure against hers, the kiss both a promise and a beginning. Catherine wound her arms around his neck, giving herself fully to the moment, to the man who had saved her in every possible way. When they finally parted, both breathless, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Catherine Wilson. Have almost since the day I found you. I love you too, Catherine whispered, the words coming easily, naturally, as if her heart had always known they were meant for him. Around them, the ranch hands who had remained behind let out whoops and cheers, bringing a blush to Catherine's cheeks and a rare, full laugh from Quincy. He took her hand in his, leading her into the house that had become her home, away from the curious eyes of the men. In the quiet of the parlor, he kissed her again, more deeply this time, his arms strong around her waist. Catherine surrendered to the joy of it, to the knowledge that this good, honorable man loved her, that the life stretching before them was full of promise. The legal proceedings against Emmett Lawson and Thomas Blackwell moved swiftly by frontier standards. Emmett was charged with attempted murder, theft, and fraud, while Blackwell faced charges of conspiracy and attempted kidnapping. Catherine's testimony, along with evidence provided by witnesses from Elko and Kingston, ensured that both men would spend years in the territorial prison. As Quincy had predicted, Catherine's divorce was granted with remarkable speed given the circumstances. By the time spring brought new green to the hills around Kingston, she was legally Catherine Wilson once more, free of the man who had nearly destroyed her life. With the threats against them neutralized and Catherine's legal status settled, Quincy finally asked the question that had been in his heart since Christmas. They were riding together on a perfect April morning, checking the new calves in the east pasture. Wildflowers dotted the hills, and the air was sweet with sage and pine. Quincy reined his horse to a stop on a ridge overlooking the valley, waiting for Catherine to do the same. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, gesturing to the panorama of his ranch spread out below them, the buildings tiny in the distance. It is, Catherine agreed, breathing in the crisp air. You've built something wonderful here, Quincy. Not quite finished building yet, he replied, turning to face her. His expression was serious but tender. There's something missing. Catherine raised an eyebrow, curious. What's that? Quincy dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. When they were standing face to face, he took both her hands in his. A wife, he said simply. A partner to share it all with. He drew a deep breath. Catherine Wilson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of making this ranch your permanent home? Though she had anticipated this moment, had even dreamed of it, Catherine found herself momentarily speechless with joy. Tears filled her eyes as she squeezed Quincy's hands. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Quincy, nothing would make me happier. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of exuberance that made her laugh with delight. When he set her down again, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. It was my mother's, he explained as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. My father gave it to her right on this spot, 40 years ago. Catherine held out her trembling hand, watching as Quincy slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly as if it had been made for her. It's beautiful, she said softly. I'll treasure it always. There's something else, Quincy said, suddenly looking nervous. I wrote to your father last month, asked for his blessing. Catherine stared at him in surprise. You wrote to my father. What did he say? Quincy's smile returned. He said he'd been hoping for this ever since he got your letters about the kind rancher who rescued you. Said any man who'd give all his water to a stranger in the desert was the kind of man he'd be proud to call son. Fresh tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks at the thought of her father's approval. "I've missed him so much," she admitted. "I was afraid he'd think less of me after everything that happened with Emmett." "Actually," Quincy said, his eyes twinkling, "he's coming to the wedding." Said wild horses couldn't keep him away. Catherine threw her arms around Quincy's neck, overwhelmed with happiness. "When did you arrange all this?" "I've been planning to ask you for months," Quincy confessed, holding her close. "Was just waiting for everything to be settled legally." "Your father will be here in 3 weeks. I thought we might be married in early May if that suits you, unless you want more time to prepare." "3 weeks is perfect," Catherine assured him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I don't need anything elaborate. Just you and this land we'll share." Quincy kissed her then, deep and thorough, sealing their promise amid the wildflowers and sage. Catherine gave herself to the kiss, to the man who had found her at her lowest moment and seen not weakness but courage, who had given her not just water but a new life, a new home, a new beginning. They were married on the first Saturday in May in the small white church in Kingston. The entire town turned out for the wedding, along with ranchers from miles around, all eager to witness the union of the respected rancher and the beloved schoolteacher whose dramatic story had captured everyone's imagination. Catherine's father, Robert Wilson, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and his daughter's hazel eyes, gave her away. The joy on his face as he placed her hand in Quincy's spoke volumes about his approval of her choice. Catherine wore a gown of ivory satin ordered from Sacramento with Mrs. Abernathy's finest lace shawl around her shoulders. Quincy, handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. The vows they spoke were traditional but invested with deep personal meaning, each word a promise neither took lightly. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Quincy bent to kiss his bride, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward at the ranch was the largest gathering the Double H had ever hosted. Tables laden with food stretched across the yard, and a makeshift dance floor had been constructed where Quincy and Catherine shared their first dance as husband and wife under a canopy of stars. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, they slipped away for a quiet moment alone. Standing on the porch of what was now truly their home, Quincy wrapped his arms around Catherine from behind, both of them gazing out at the land that had brought them together. "Happy, Mrs. Harding," Quincy murmured against her ear. Catherine leaned back against his chest, savoring the solid strength of him, the rightness of his arms around her. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "And you?" "I never knew happiness like this existed," Quincy admitted, turning her gently in his arms to face him. "You've changed everything, Catherine, this ranch, my life. It all has meaning it didn't have before." Catherine reached up to touch his face, marveling at how much love she felt for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I think we saved each other," she said softly. Quincy smiled, bending to kiss her with infinite tenderness. "I plan to go on doing that for the rest of our lives," he promised against her lips. 10 years later, on a warm summer evening, Catherine sat on that same porch, watching as Quincy taught their 8-year-old son, Robert, how to throw a lasso in the yard. Their 6-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, sat beside Catherine, carefully stitching a sampler while their youngest, 3-year-old Michael, played with wooden blocks at their feet. The Double H Ranch had prospered over the past decade, growing to become one of the largest and most successful operations in the territory. The house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, and Catherine had eventually given up teaching to focus on raising their children and helping Quincy run the ranch. Robert Wilson had moved from Sacramento to Kingston 5 years earlier, opening a small mercantile in town and building a cottage nearby where he spent much of his time doting on his grandchildren. His presence completed their family circle, healing the last of the wounds from Catherine's painful past. As Catherine watched her husband and son laughing together in the golden evening light, she thought about how far they had come since that desperate day in the desert. The memory of Emmett Lawson had faded to a distant shadow, no longer carrying any power to hurt her. He had been released from prison after serving his sentence, but had never returned to Nevada, disappearing somewhere in the east according to the last reports they'd heard. What remained vivid in her memory was the moment Quincy had found her, his face appearing like a mirage above her, the blessed relief of water on her parched lips, the gentle strength of his hands as he lifted her onto his horse. That moment of grace had changed everything, setting her on a path to the rich, full life she now lived. Quincy looked up then, catching her eye across the yard. The smile he gave her still made her heart skip, even after all these years. He said something to Robert before crossing to the porch, leaning down to kiss her lightly. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, settling beside her and pulling little Michael onto his lap. "The day we met," Catherine replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "How you gave me all your water." Quincy chuckled, his arm coming around her shoulders. "Best trade I ever made." "Trade?" Catherine questioned, looking up at him curiously. Quincy's gray eyes, still as clear and honest as the day they'd met, crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "I gave you water," he said simply, "and you gave me everything else." As the sun set over their land, painting the hills in shades of gold and purple, Catherine Harding looked at her family, the strong, good man beside her, their beautiful children, the home they'd built together, and knew with absolute certainty that from the ashes of betrayal, she had found something infinitely precious. A love as vast and enduring as the western sky above them.